So here we are busy recording. So welcome everyone to the third live session of this JED's ecological dimension. The main theme that we want to carry on with from the previous two sessions is the continuation of the Earth systems and the importance of aligning whatever we do with agriculture to add value to the Earth system's restoration. So we're going to start looking at the rationale for healthy organic soils. We look at regenerative and permaculture design processes, the benefits of local food, and so on. There's quite a lengthy number of slides, but these are the eight various themes that we're going to speak to. The first one, the role of regenerative agriculture within the Earth systems, and then food security in the economy. How do we build humus-rich soil and thus sequestrate carbon? Then we're going to zoom in at a permaculture design process, and similarly with the regenerative agriculture. I think just some interesting design elements we're going to look at very briefly, and then some urban permaculture solutions, and we're going to finish off with some cutting-edge permaculture sources of inspiration. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to hand over to my dear colleague Jacqueline. She's going to run through items 1 and 2, and then add value throughout the process as we go along. So it's the role of regenerative agriculture within Earth systems, and it's over to you, Jacqueline.
Okay, thank you. Where I want to start this week is by taking some of the principles that we started with in the previous two models and look at how we carry these forward. So in the first module, we looked at a whole systems approach. We looked at closing the loops to maintain the functional cycles of the Earth systems. So those are the hydrological, the carbon, the nitrogen, and the nutrient cycles. And these are all the things that make life on Earth possible. In module 2, we looked more specifically at these cycles through the technology for dealing with waste, in particular wastewater, and in particular, how we go about doing that. The most important principle that we talked about in that is that waste from one organism is food for another. This is what drives the whole nutrient cycle. So last session, I introduced this little map, which is here again on the top left-hand side of the slide. It's not really a map, it's the tree of life. And I introduced it last time, but didn't actually deal with it. On this map, we actually find something which is completely different that we've seen before with the tree of life, in which we expect as humans to be right at the top of the tree and all the other species to be arranged in branches below us. In actual fact, this new tree of life, which has been drawn up on the basis of the discoveries made by the Human Microbiome Project and the Earth Microbiome Project. And we find ourselves down in that little green branch on the bottom right-hand corner, where we find, in fact, all of the life forms that we come to think of as as nature, including ourselves, because those are the ones that we can see. Those are the ones that are also animals that have cells with nuclei. But that branch of life on this planet is actually quite small, and all of the others are microscopic life that we can't see, but they play an extremely important role in the functioning of the biosphere. So all of these microbes that you can see in families right the way through the tree of life, They are, might be minuscule, but they are tiny little chemical factories. They are tiny powerhouses, regulating the cycles, taking part in the cycle of nutrients, and the majority of them are not pathogens. They're actually beneficial, and they're even insiders because they're in our gut. They're absolutely 100% essential to life on Earth. So last week we found them working for us in waste treatment. So I'd like to start with the red box, where last week we saw that the bacteria were turning waste into nutrients through composting, toilets, biodigesters, wetlands, reed beds, etc. And all of these nutrients that have been made for us by the microbial life should really be returned to the soil. So below that, I put a little map of the soil food web. So what's happening here in the soil is that there are also a very wide range of microbial life forms. In fact, if you take one handful of living soil, what you'll find in there, if you could see them, there are more microbial life forms in that handful of soil than all the people who have ever lived on this planet. It's really quite amazing. And they're very important in the soil as well, because they are once again turning waste into nutrients. They are part of the food web, so they are being eaten by other life forms, including the invertebrates, including small mammals, earthworms, and birds, all of which are really important for maintaining a living soil. The most important aspect, though, for us probably is that while we think that we feed the soil feed the plants by giving the plants nutrients, in actual fact, it is the microbes in the soil that are passing nutrients from the soil into the plants, into their root systems. So if you have no microbes in the soil, if it's not alive, then you have plants that are very weak in nutrient value. So if we look at the next blue arrow, which goes to the left, we can see that the bacteria and fungi in the soil are feeding the plants. So these plants are actually the primary producers of all food on the planet, because they are the only life forms that can use solar radiation to set in motion a chemical process by which they make carbohydrates and use nitrogen as well for amino acids and proteins. So the primary producers produce the basis of the food system. And along come the primary consumers, that are the herbivores, and then the secondary consumers are the carnivores that eat the herbivores, and the omnivores like us that eat just about everything. And of course, in that process, in that food chain, what happens is that we produce waste, and so that waste goes back to the red box again, and we end up with a cycle of nutrients, which is effectively our food system. Can I have the next slide, please, Ezio? Okay, now I want to look at that food system again in just a little bit more detail, so that we can see why we should eat local food, because that's really the objective of this module, is to talk about local food systems, and why, if we do that, we can create a closed loop nutrient cycle. So let's start with that red box again. So we have all of the nutrients there in the red box, and we can do two things with them. One, we can throw the nutrients out of the cycle, which is usually what happens with most municipal sewage treatment plants. What they do is they treat the nutrients in order, they treat the waste in order to make it safe, and then they just dump it into rivers and into lakes and into the sea, of course. that means that we lose a whole load of nutrients out of the nutrient cycle. So the best thing to do really is to put them back into the soil locally. So we make a contribution then to the soil food web. We're actually feeding the soil microbiome, which is really important, of course, because the more of them we have, the more of them there are to pass nutrients onto the plants, which they do if we create an agricultural system which mimics nature, which you can see then in the box to the left of that. So through this system, we're creating nutrient-dense food, and we once again have two options. We could either export it, and actually that should be a red arrow. I don't know how it turned blue. But if we export our food, what we're doing, we're actually exporting our nutrients and our water. And so we lose them out of the cycle. Or we can eat them locally, in which case they pass into our gut microbiome, and also, of course, into the microbiomes of all the other animals and invertebrates and birds that take part in that food chain. And our gut microbes deal with the food by digesting it for us. They turn it into vitamins, they turn it into enzymes, they turn it into amino acids that are the building blocks of protein. So all these microbiomes are really essential, and every living creature on the planet has a microbiome, no matter how small it is. The tiniest insect actually also has a gut microbiome. And of course, the waste product from this goes back into the red box where we treat all the waste. And so we get a very little nice local food system going. Another option would be, in fact, to import foods, because this is really what happens a lot of the time. We're importing foods, but we're then importing nutrients and water from other places where they might actually not be able to spare that water and those nutrients. And they really should be putting that water and nutrients back into their own cycle. The result of this, the trade in food, the export and the import, really inclines us a lot more to be dependent on artificial fertilizers, much more dependent on growing things in bulk, because that's how the money is made, which means that we end up with a monocropping agriculture. We lose biodiversity through that. And also because of the added irrigation, we end up also disturbing the hydrological cycle. So I think it's quite clear there that it's really important to keep our nutrient cycles going on a local basis. And it's also a lot healthier for our own gut microbiome to be in contact with the microbiomes in our ecosystems in general. So I put something in the little green box at the bottom which pertains to this, which is that really we should think, usually we think that we feed plants when we give them nutrients or fertilizers. We really should think about feeding the soil, because we're feeding the soil microbes and then they will feed the plant. Also, when we're thinking about ourselves, we shouldn't think about feeding the person, but we're feeding our gut, we're feeding the microbes in our gut. So that's just a little paradigm shift in the way that we look at ourselves and our part in the food system and what we're actually doing in growing food. Shall we go on to the next slide, please, Ezio? Thank you. Because I've been talking about cycles here, I'd like to take that just that step further, because what we've also been talking about is really relationships and interactions between the different elements in the different parts of the cycle. And in fact, that really is a definition of an ecosystem. So if we're mimicking nature in our agricultural systems, if that's what we want to do, then what we're doing is that we're creating these series of relationships and the network of relationships and interactions. So I put the picture of a tree here, which in its own right is a sort of ecosystem. The soil could be regarded as an ecosystem. We build ecosystems within ecosystems. It's quite a complex thing, but on the other hand, it's also quite a simple thing too, if we just look at it from the point of view of the relationship. So that very first essential relationship is that the waste from one species is food from another. And that feeds into the food chain, in which we have the primary producers, which are the plants, the trees. And then we have the herbivores, the carnivores, the omnivores, and the decomposers that recycle those nutrients again. We have the hydrological cycle itself, which is present all the time, because if we're creating a real ecosystem, we're holding water within it, but we're also putting in more plants that transpire and send more water vapor back up into the hydrological cycle. And of course, we're creating oxygen too. It's a very interesting way to look at this. If we think about the oxygen we breathe, we tend to take it for granted. But in actual fact, oxygen is the waste product of photosynthesis. So oxygen itself is a waste product, and we're here to recycle that waste. So ecosystems are also carbon sinks. Ezio is going to go on to talk about that a little bit more. The idea of keeping the soil alive so that it's a little ecosystem in its own right, that's really important. Multifunctionality and redundancy is another, these are two interrelated concepts in the ecosystem, which we also talk about a great deal in permaculture, that the elements can be multifunctional, so that the one insect might be carrying out a service for another element, and also carrying out a service within the cycle, so that the more multifunctional elements we have in there, the more resilient our system is. And that's particularly important with the concept of redundancy. The more diversity and the more numbers of species and the numbers of within the species that we have is very important too, because if you get a very bad shock to your ecosystem, for example, a bad storm or a summer of drought, some of those elements are going to be knocked out, but the more elements you have that are multifunctional, the more that they are likely to be able to jump in and perform those functions. And this is really, in a natural forest, what makes an ecosystem resilient. The fungi, the mycorrhizal networks, are important too, not only because they have many functions, like breaking down some of the nutrients, but also passing nutrients to trees. They live around the tree's roots and pass nutrients to them, but also because they're capable of actually taking messages, chemical messages called pheromones, to other trees, and also to pass sugars between trees. And this is a relatively new discovery, which is really, really exciting, that trees can actually talk to each other, not exactly the way we do, but still through chemical messengers, they communicate, and that below soil, below the ground level in soil, there is actually something that scientists are calling a wood wide web of communication. Then we have also nitrogen uptake and recycling. It's very important as well to realize that the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle both are driven within ecosystems. They provide habitat for pollinators and seed dispersal, which is also really important, as we will see later on when we're thinking about permaculture and putting together food systems that mimic nature, because we also need to have plants in there that will be habitats for pollinators and that will take our seeds around for self-seeding plants. So what I want to impress on you with this is that a local, healthy, nutrient-dense food system can only be produced where there is a healthy diverse ecosystem. Next slide, please, Ezio. Now, this is the final slide in this section, and I wanted to look at it in particular because we talk a great deal about climate change, but we don't look at some of the other of the planetary boundaries that we are transgressing with serious risk to the survival of life on the planet. And if we look at these three, which we have transgressed quite seriously, we can see that there is a very, very clear link to industrial agriculture there. So right in the top left-hand corner, we have biosphere integrity. And there are two parts to this. There's the loss of genetic diversity and there's the loss of biomass. Now, the loss of genetic diversity, which is already up there in the red zone, pertains to the extinction of species globally. So when they're gone, or bioregionally. So for example, they might be extinct within a particular country or a bioregion or a part of the world, but are not completely extinct globally yet. And that's in the red zone. So this is actually becoming a very serious issue that we really need to take into account when we're designing. The other aspect of the biosphere integrity is functional diversity, which pertains to biomass, as it's called. So it's the numbers within a species. And it's there's a question mark in that little triangle on the diagram, because it's very difficult to collect information about this. There haven't been as many studies carried out. Particularly most of the studies we have are quite recent, so it's very difficult to establish a baseline going back, say, a century or 2 centuries or so. But one thing that we do know is that the loss of functional diversity, the numbers of species, is very serious since around about the Second World War, with the implementation of industrial agriculture. So the figures for Europe are more or less that we have lost about 50% of wildlife within the last 40 years. And what is even more frightening is that a study in Germany recently showed that we have lost about 76% of winged insects in just 27 years. Now, of course, given that an ecosystem, as I've just shown you, requires a wide diversity of species interacting with each other to remain healthy, the loss of all of these species is potentially leading us to what's called ecosystem collapse. And that then leads to a collapse of the functional cycles, which means that it affects our ability to produce food. So next I'd like to look right down at the bottom at the biogeochemical flows, which you can see are phosphorus and nitrogen. Now this is very serious as well, and it's due to the use of artificial fertilizers, which are called NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. We are overusing artificial fertilizers, which aren't good for us anyway, because they come in a powdered form. The fact that they come in powder means that they don't, there's no real uptake or not enough uptake in the soil and in the plant, so they wash through when it rains. Nitrogen in particular is really quite serious here because it washes off the land, it washes into the rivers and the lakes and down into the oceans, and it is feeding certain types of algae, algal blooms they are called, which then kill all other life in the area. And we're finding that along in the rivers and in lakes, and particularly along coastlines where agricultural nitrogen washes out into the sea, that we have these things called dead zones. Land system change there in the middle is really quite obvious then when we're looking at this, because There is urbanization, of course. We're covering a lot more of our land with concrete and tarmac and houses and shopping malls and all of these things. And we're taking away the habitats that wildlife need to live and to reproduce and to provide food for itself. But very importantly as well, we see that the change from woodland and pasture to arable land for growing crops, particularly grains, is the land system change there has been drastic since the beginning of the Second World War. And of course, deforestation is part of that as well. So we can see clearly that industrial agriculture is playing a major role in these functions that are starting to break down. With regard to the soil, again, because of the overuse of these particular type of artificial fertilizers and because of pesticides and other chemicals, we are causing so much soil erosion that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says we have about 50 harvests left, which is really quite scary. But we can do something about it. It's so simple that all we need to do is to make a transition to growing our food the way nature does it, through ecosystems, through mimicking nature. So on the right-hand side, I put these green boxes, and these are the things that we can do. So if we are worried about biosphere integrity and genetic diversity and biomass, then we restore ecosystems and create habitats and forage for wildlife. We do this by doing a whole range of different agricultural methods like permaculture, agroecology, silver pasture. All of these, what is really important is that they're also polycultures. They are not monocultures, which lead to the removal of those ecosystems. If we do this, we can sequester carbon, so we're dealing with climate change as well. We create the food chain, which means that integral pest management is possible, so that if we have insects that are eating our crops, we will also have insects and birds that eat those insects. This is what we call integral pest management, which requires a healthy ecosystem. We can restore the living soil. We can do regenerative agriculture, holistic grazing, and mob grazing, which plays a major role in soil restoration and sequestering carbon. And we do this also through systems of agroecology and gardening, which are no-till and no-dig, so that we don't disturb the soil. And of course, if we look at that red box in which we are putting too much phosphorus and nitrogen into the soil, instead of doing that, all we need to do is to go back and look at what we did in the slides earlier. We recycled the nutrients. Really simple. Okay, next slide, please, Ezio. We're going to move on to the second section, which is about food security and the economy. I'm going to do that very briefly because food security is something we really need to talk about seriously. And given what I've shown you, all of these breakdowns in the functional cycles and in the ecosystems, and also with climate change, then, it's quite scary, and fear is really never a good thing unless we transfer it into action. One of the things that's holding us back is the economy, because an economy which is based on economic growth tends to regard all natural resources simply as things that can be exploited. Extractivism, just like mining, they are mining the soil and mining the resources. And of course, when we do that, all of the waste and all of the damage is referred to in this present economic system as externals. And they don't think that they need to deal with that at all. It's something you can just ignore. And I'm not going to go into more detail about that because David Suzuki, who's a remarkable environmental activist, is much more eloquent on the subject of what's wrong with the economy and the economy's attitude to nature in a speech that I posted on the Facebook page. So if you want to go and look at it, you can do that. Briefly, I just want to run through a few things that have happened since the Second World War when it boils down to human rights. So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights right after the Second World War, and more recently, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and those Sustainable Development Goals ratify a lot of the things that were in the original Declaration of Human Rights, and they add to it, of course, the right to food and the right to health. Sandwiched somewhere in the middle, we have the Rio Declaration of 1992, which did give some rights to the planet, to Earth itself, though obviously not enough for us to be able to use it to protect the Earth. Though there is a great deal of talk about including a law against ecocide in the laws that are prosecutable with the International Criminal Court. And there are groups out there called End Ecocide that are trying to lobby the United Nations to get that type of law introduced. Can I have the next slide, please? Happily, over the last few years, there have been quite a lot of conferences and reports. I'm not going to go through them in detail. The UN Special Rapporteur, Olivier de Schutter, concluded in his report that we need a switch to agroecology to solve all of these problems. And he concluded, after traveling the world and talking to a lot of people who are doing agroecology, that it is possible to feed the world through agroecology. And UNCTAD and the Food and Agriculture Organization also came to the same conclusion in 2 reports. Next slide, please. We can feed the world. Yes, you hear the agribusinesses all the time telling us that their industrial agriculture need to be intensified, and we need more biotech, which is basically genetically modified organisms, because that is the only way to feed the world. Well, actually, that is not true. It is irrefutable that 70% of the food that is grown on this planet is grown by small-scale farmers using agroecological methods on just 30% of the agricultural land in South America, Africa, and Asia. So if we adopt these methods on a much broader scale, then we're going to be fine, and so is the Earth. Next slide, please. Just one slide about food and climate change, because there are huge debates around this at the moment. These are the statistics from GRAIN, which is an absolutely excellent NGO dealing with food and all of the problems of food. They bring out oodles of reports about food in all different parts of the world and agriculture. And if you need any information, I could suggest that this is probably one of the most reliable sources that you can go to. What I find the most interesting here is the statistic in the top left-hand corner, which is that 25 to 40% of the current excess CO2 in the atmosphere comes from destruction of the soils. And so I would say, well, that's okay, then we can fix that, can't we? All we need to do is to repair the ecosystems, to sequester carbon in the soil, and that should be the ticket. Okay, over to SEO.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So what Jacqueline provided was a very rich backdrop about the Earth systems and the importance of working with nature and to enhance these Earth systems. And the solutions are very simple. They're all out there. And so the next couple of slides, we're going to focus on some of the solutions. And the first thing that comes to mind is, how can we build up the rich humus soils that can at the same time provide a great habitat for life, but also sequester carbon. And so just as background, you'll see this pie chart here. This is the typical makeup of a plot of soil. You've got 20 to 30% air, 20 to 30% water, and that defines pretty much the soil pore space. Then we have 45% of minerals, and these will vary in makeup, radically across the planet. But at the end of the day, one clod in Africa and one clod in Asia, this is the general makeup of good, healthy soil. And then there's this little sliver of organic soil, or humus as we call. And if we've got 5%, we're doing well. That's typically what you find in unspoiled nature. Now, what happens with industrial agriculture? Well, the farmers using industrial agriculture, they put pesticides and fertilizers, so that strips away the organic component. By over-plowing, they compress the soil, so they squeeze out the air and the water. So all they're left with is these minerals compacted, which form clay. And this is why they need ever heavier machinery to rip open the soil and plow forever again. And there's a famous book written a couple of years ago called The Farmer, the Plow, and the Devil. And that just explains it all in the title. So what we try and do with regenerative agriculture and permaculture and that is to try and build up soils by promoting roots that can have long root structures where it provides a habitat for the bacteria and so forth. And also aerated soils, because all these root systems are basically shafts where the water can come down, up and down, and this is a healthy soil on this side, whereas these plants here with very mangly short roots, these are not too healthy. So we try and build soils through the root structure.
Can I just jump in for a second, Ezio, there?
Yes, yeah.
This is quite important because it's in that 5% of organic matter where you've actually, that includes all the microbial life forms. And it's also really important when you have these root systems that they are aerated, that there's 20 to 30% of air in there as well, because these bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi are actually aerobic, so that they need air to live.
Yeah, that's correct. So you'll find that the aerobic bacteria tend to live on the surface, whilst the anaerobic bacteria, those are the ones that break down the minerals at the lower end here, and they, with long roots, those little minerals are able to be brought up through the plant root system. So we need both forms of bacteria. And this slide is quite interesting. It just shows a comparison on the left-hand side here with the soil that's been mob grazed at the top, and one that's been conventionally cropped, or we could say industrially cropped. So industrially cropped, it's an open pasture with fences, and the cattle or sheep or whatever livestock is in there, they've just been grazing as and when they please. They generally choose the choicest pieces of grass and they leave the rest open. And with that, you don't get a uniform grazing. Whereas on the left-hand side, you've got a managed livestock with uniform grazing, meaning that they graze the grass continually, and the manure from the livestock feeds the soil. And look at the texture of the difference in the soil. The soil on the left-hand side is darker, it's got a lot more humus, at least up to 30 centimeters, whereas the other soil is quite compacted here. These roots don't penetrate that deep. So just by packing in the humus in the soil, and we'll explain this in a few more slides how we can achieve this, we start moving towards a healthy humus-rich soil. So how do we go about building rich humus soil? So we need sun, air, and water. We need biologically available minerals. Number 3, we need living things in the soil. These are the plants and animals and their byproducts. And then living things on the soil, meaning on top. These are the plants and the animals and their byproducts. So let's just pause here. Number 3 then is the soil food web within the soil. And generally, number 4 here, living things on top, is having managed livestock at the top here, whose dung and manure is in a closed loop cycle that fertilizes the soil. And then number 5, intermittent and patchy disturbance regime. That sounds quite scientific, but basically in brackets it means emulating the wild herds contained by predators. So we'll be posting a link, if I'm not mistaken, it is in the manual, but we're going to emphasize it in the notices. There's a talk, a TED talk by Alan Savory on holistic management. And basically what we do with holistic management is that we mimic what happens in the Great Plains and the savannas and what used to happen with the big bison herds and so forth. In those days you had predators that kept these herds together. So those herds, they grazed that grass flat. There was no choice between sweet grass and sour grass. They ate everything that was there, and they dunged it and they fertilized it. And then the predators came along and the whole herd shifted. So that was intermittent and patchy disturbance. So there was a closed loop cycle between the manure that was dumped in one spot and this underlying soil. The herd then moved on as it was chased by predators. And that's how we sustained this great savannas and the prairies. Along comes industrial agriculture, and they just allow the cattle to roam around and eat what they want. So they will eat the choicest grasses and leave the rest. So what happens with the other grasses? They clump up, and then when it rains, it forms erosion around there, and within a few decades, you've got a desert. And so we need to mimic what happens in nature by predators. Let's move on, and we'll explain again how we can get this done. So the important thing with having humus in the soil is that it not only sequesters carbon, but it also allows more moisture to be retained. Now, this researcher, Dr. Christine Jones, that you see in the table with the blue highlights from amazingcarbon.com, she put these statistics together to help the whole regenerative agriculture movement in Australia about 10 odd years ago. And what is interesting here is that on the left-hand side, you've got the change in OC. OC is organic carbon, which is humus, from 1% up to 4%. And then you've got the change in the third column in the water retention, or even in the fourth column. These are the liters per hectare, or you could say kiloliters per hectare. So there's 144,000 kiloliters of water that is held in soil at 1% humus. But if you increase that humus to 4%, look how much extra moisture you can actually hold in the soil. So if you just have good, healthy soils, there's no reason why there should be a drought there, because so much moisture is retained in the soil. And then the big benefit out of that, the last column in the blue part of the table, is the carbon, the CO2 that can be sequestrated. 132 tons per hectare at 1%, right up to 528 tons per hectare. Now, I got so excited by this table that a few years later, I extrapolated these numbers for the South African context. And now you see the extension to the table in green. Now, I'll describe what these numbers mean. So at the top, on the first green column on the left, you'll see 417,000 kilotons of CO2 emissions. That was South Africa's annual emission in 2015. South Africa has got 12.5 million hectares of arable land. Now, if we do increase the organic carbon or humus in the soils, just at 1%, we can sequestrate 1.6 million tons per hectare, which is 4 times the 417 that is actually emitted. So strictly speaking, we only need to do in South Africa 25% of our arable land at only a 1% increase in organic carbon to sequestrate South Africa's entire CO2 emissions in 1 year. If we want to drill down to the 4% level, then we only need to do 6% of our arable land of 12.5 million to sequestrate our entire emissions over 1 year. So the big conclusion at the bottom there is that arguably farmers are capable of single-handedly saving the planet. And I'm sure one could extrapolate this table to whatever country you're in, and you'll find a pretty similar result. So this is really exciting stuff. It's not only the carbon sequestration, it's the moisture retention through the humus that can break the drought cycles and restore the hydrological cycle in the landscape. So another slide that drums that in was by one of the descendants of Ellen Yeomans, by the way, one of the descendants of P.A. Yeomans. And his estimate was that almost 12% of the Earth's surface is arable. And if we could get down to 300 parts per million of CO2, we only need to increase the soil organic carbon by 1.6%. And we'll sort out all our CO2 emissions. So again, this is another researcher who's saying the organic farmers of the world can do this. Why is it that at all these COP conferences, the whole aspect of regenerative agriculture is quietly sidelined in favor of the transnational industrial agriculturalists? Let's look now at a permaculture design process. This is a process straight out of the manual, but in the next few slides, we just unpack it because it's not easy to explain this process. So my background is project management in the built environment. So the permaculture design principles were a bit wishy-washy for me, and I tried to consolidate them into a process that I could use them productively. So I defined the project cycle in permaculture as a site analysis, then evolving into a concept design, packing on more detail through a detailed design layout, and then implementing the project and then sustaining the project. But I want to focus on two aspects here which are very important. Under the site analysis, you start off with all the background research, the status quo, the physical attributes, the local biological health, and then the local climate sector analysis. So we're going to look at an example of that. And then this leaves you with a base plan upon which to plan. Now, your concept plan, you start off with having a long-term vision for a project. And then how do you start your design? And this is where, as you get writer's block, you get designer's block. What's the first thing that you put on a map in terms of design? So the inspiration I got here was Yeoman's scale of permanence, because this lays out the sequence of how one goes about to prepare a plan. So we're going to unpack the sequence in a bit more detail, but once you've got the sequence, it provides a framework plan for all the other bits and pieces to slot into. So now you've got the natural flows and patterns that reinforce this framework. You incorporate some wild design, and then the output of it is a concept plan. And that moves on to a detailed design plan where you look at your concept plan and you start refining the framework and looking at the flows and patterns. Now you pack in all the micro design, you integrate everything, you end up with a design plan. And as you go on to implementation, you start looking at all your quantities, your plant lists, your budget estimates, your Gantt chart in terms of a program, and you start committing resources and you start implementing. And then very importantly, how do you sustain it? Well, you need to maintain it, then you evaluate it continually, and there's always tweaking that can be done. And if there's a major extension to a project, well then you go back to stage one, and you go through this process again. Now, we spend 12 days on a permaculture design course unpacking this in a lot of detail. So this course just introduces you to this concept, So don't get too bewildered if you don't understand it. We're putting it in the manual because it's an important process to at least understand. But the mastering of this you can do through more subsequent courses on the PDC or through regenerative agriculture and so forth. But let's have a look at a sector analysis. So these are two beautiful examples extracted from case studies that were done by JED students in previous years. The Rockside Ranch, this is a small holding near Mount St. Helens. And you can see the yellow is the winter sun. There's a summer sun angle. There's a summer winds. There's a fire sector threat. There's the main road on this side here. So this is where the utilities come in. And you've got noise factors from here. You've got your cold northerly winds. This helps you a lot in so far as coming up with your design concept. And then Vermont together in Switzerland, they stretched the zone analysis here for an entire valley. And they also then did a permaculture zone layout. And typically of the Swiss, they've got the hot spring winds from the south, they've got the cold winter rainfall coming from the northerly part, they've got the wildlife corridor, and they're in a blissful corridor, so their view shed is this green desired view right around them. That's also important because sometimes you want to site a house facing the desired view. So that was an example of a sector analysis. Let's look now at that framework that we spoke about. How do you create a concept framework that you can refine as you move along? So the example I'm using for the framework design is the Ndumu case study. So the Ndumu case study, this is for an entire town, but it could also be on a smaller scale for a small holding. You follow the water. So if you look at the contours in a bit of detail here, you'll see there's a little hill here with a saddle in the middle. This lends itself to creating a saddle dam. And these brown things are swales. So you collect the rainwater from the hilltop and you channel it to this little dam. So your hilltop becomes like your roof, and the swale is the equivalent of a gutter. Along this ridge line here, there's also a slight little saddle, so that can also contain water. And then these are all other small little catchment dams. So here's the rainwater harvesting plan as the first critical element of the design, concept design. The next stage, we follow the swales and we decide where can we align it with access roads. So here you've got the light brown as access roads, and then forest belts in green. So we integrate three things. We integrate swales from rainwater harvesting, access roads or pathways, and forest belts. And then with that framework, we then drape over the permaculture zones. And before we know it, here's a whole town plan layout where we've got zone 1 being, or zone 0 rather, being the central lake with a park on each side. And then zone 1 is the commercial and public facilities. Zone 2 along here would be your public housing. Zone 3 would be your agricultural allotments. Zone 4, on the steeper parts of land here, you have your orchards and passive open space. And then zone 5, on the steeper slopes, or the steepest slopes rather, you've got your natural environment and also down into the wetland down here at the bottom. So that's an example of a framework design for a permaculture process. Now look at your handout and the additional documents that have been uploaded, and you'll see the full Ndumu case study presentation. How we then use this layout, we superimpose it over the current reality, which was an absolute mess that was happening on the ground. And we were able, from a holistic perspective, to superimpose the two and zoom in and see where could we apply our minds to retrofit what was on the ground or to realign a design that hadn't yet been constructed. So that's how this case study was used. Now, the regenerative agriculture process took a bit of the mystery out of permaculture, and it was based on Yeoman's scale of permanence, which was in the permaculture Bible from the beginning, but it was never really given that much value until the regenerative movement came along and they redefined Yeoman's scale of permanence into 10 steps. Now we're going to unpack some of these steps, but at the end of the day, what regenerative agriculture is doing is building up soils and recreating the lost biodiversity that used to be in these particular landscapes. Okay. Sorry, I'm busy talking, so I'm not really picking up the chats, unless you can pick them up for me, Jacqueline. If there's any critical things now. Anyway, so this is the process for Regen Ag. Moving on then, the importance of the hydrological cycle. We saw the slide last week, but as soon as you've got good, healthy soils and you've got ground cover through biomass trees or grasslands, we start revitalizing the full hydrological cycle, which is the basis of regenerative agriculture. Then, insofar as the geography is concerned, one of the low-hanging fruits is wherever you've got an eroded landscape with a riverbed or stream bed that's been badly eroded, what it means is that the water table has dropped here. And it's very easy to fix this up. We just fill up this donga with gabion baskets or rock walls, and slowly the silt backs up against it, and you raise the water table. As you raise the water table, all the trees and biomass that was here starts coming back. So this is how we can rehabilitate riparian zones. How do we follow the water in the landscape? Here's a classic example of undeveloped natural capital. You'll see this green spot of grass here. Now this is where the slope changes from convex to concave. And that point of change is called the inflection point. That's where the water slows down, and there's always green grass there, and that's exactly where we put a high catchment dam. We create cut-off drains or swales that feed into it, so we then collect water, not only that water that comes down the valley, all the water in front. We build a swale with a high point in front of the dam, leading to a low point on the dam wall. So we collect all the water that's in front of the dam back to the dam. And if you look at this landscape, can you see that little small saddle in the landscape there? And that lends itself to having a saddle dam at the top. Now the beauty of swales, this is what happens. You slow down the water, you spread it, and you sink it, just like we learned in module 2. As you do that, you've got more moisture in the soil, and that can support a forest belt of trees, indigenous trees or fruit and nut trees, or whatever the choice is in that particular area. So imagine these forest belts now. What do you plant here? Well, you effectively need to go and study your local makeup of trees in your area. So you've got upper canopy trees. These are the number ones here that are spaced 10 to 12 meters apart. You've got mid canopy trees, you've got understory trees, you've got shrubs, climbers, and ground covers. You assemble these in a pattern like this, but you would need to do your own research to see what fits in your locality. These are typical trees that are on the east coast of Southern Hemisphere, 30 degrees south on the east coast, and this is what you'd find growing there. So typically KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape in South Africa, Queensland in Australia, and Uruguay, top end of Argentina in South America. So you'll find all these types of trees there. Regarding soils now, how do we fix up soils that have been overplowed and diminished through industrial agriculture? Now, remember the makeup of a typical clod of soil? So now imagine this top part of the soil here in this image is badly compacted, hardly anything is growing. In nature, it will probably take 1,000 years at least to restore this to its natural habitat. Why? Because industrial agriculture has squeezed the air out of it, has squeezed the water out of it, and has eliminated most of the organic matter. And the mineral component that's left, it's badly crushed and compacted, and it's virtually clay. And this is why we need bigger and bigger machinery to rip it open. But with regenerative agriculture, we can do this. Now, Pierre Yeomans not only devised the keyline rainwater harvesting system, he also came up with an ingenious keyline plow, which is basically a big ripper with a shoe at the bottom. So how did Yeoman rehabilitate this compacted soil just using the Yeoman plow? Well, what he did, he set the ripper blades down to between, depending on the compaction of the soil, between 10 to 20 centimeters as a first rip, and he just ripped the soil open. That's all he did. He then mob grazed it intensely. He put livestock on there to graze whatever was left of the grass. He shock grazed it, and then he tried to irrigate it with whatever water he had. Now, two things happen with a shock grazing. The grasses that were left, they go into shock, basically. You could say they develop a zest for life and they start rerouting. So now you've got these dead roots that are food for bacteria. So now you start attracting all the bacteria. The livestock has left its manure and everything on there, and then you flood irrigate if you can. So now you've got air gaps that come into the soil, you've got water capillaries, and you just leave it like that for 3-4 months. You let the grasses take root. You then go back there and you repeat that entire process, but you set the ripper blades between 10 to 30 centimeters. So now you rip at a deeper depth here in the soil. You repeat the process, leave it for 3-4 months, and then you come back for the last rip, 20 to 40 centimeter deep. And so now you've got varying heights of roots in the soil, and in 1 year you can rehabilitate what nature takes 1,000 years. So this is the beauty of the keyline plow. This is a close-up of what it looks like. You can see that it's a very strong blade, and they've modified these plows so much so that there's a cutting blade in front that slices through the grass. And you've got all these hoppers that give it a squirt of wormweed or whatever liquid compost. At the same time, it can pop a seed exactly into this cutting, so that whatever comes up here, whether it's maize or wheat or rice, has got a perfect microclimate for the roots to take hold. So that by the time that plant has its head above the soil here, it's really styling and resilient. Now, very importantly, we plow along the contours, along the key line contour, in fact, not up and down vertically. I think we won't go into a deep discussion on how to plow properly, but I just want to leave you with a thought. How many vineyards do you see running vertically down the landscape? And for many, many years, I was puzzled. And at the moment, I'm here in Italy with my family. And I asked a couple of wine producers, why do you guys plant your vineyards like that? You know, it just doesn't make sense from an agricultural point of view, because you're losing topsoil. How do you irrigate? And, you know, it's just nonsense there. You know what the answer was to me? was it's easy for the tractor to drive. It doesn't drive on a tilt. So there's no logic to it, absolutely no logic. But it's the sins of the fathers that have got them into this setup. And you can see how much silt is lost just on a fairly flattish piece of land, and simply because they've plowed the wrong way. So remember, always find your key line contour, and then you plow parallel to that. And in so doing, you move water from the valley line across to the ridges. Then mob grazing, I think we spoke about it briefly, but there's some good examples from Alan Savory, who set this up. And the proponents, Polyface Farm, they really went to the nth degree here. Going back to the slide, sorry, they did this very successfully with cattle. But Alan, the guy from Polyface Farms, I forget his name now, sorry, he got so anxious that the cow manure was just parking there and not doing much else. So he introduced these lay chickens. He brought in a big chicken tractor and he put an electric mesh net around it so the chickens couldn't jump out. But the chickens effectively spread the cow manure and they added their own manure, and in so doing refertilized everything. And I heard say that he did this primarily just to spread the cow shit, but after a couple of months he realized he was making more money out of the eggs than was out of the beef, and also his grasses were coming back even thicker and richer.
Hi SEO, Polyface Farm is Joel Salatin. That's
it, Joel Salatin. And Joel Salatin actually won Farmer of the Year award by Time magazine. So do have a look at his Polyface Farms. He's also on YouTube and TED Talks. He's a very inspirational speaker. Thanks,
they call him the lunatic farmer.
But look at what he's achieved. It's pretty amazing. And then the last thing about regenerative agriculture is the local economy. It's all based on stimulating the local agricultural economy. So you do that by supporting the local farmers market, community-supported agricultural, your box schemes. And then the Power Community is one huge inspiration for how they did this. And then something else I want to dwell on, and not in too much detail, but there is a handout under the additional notes about the BRICS index of fruit and veg. Now, the refractometer, which is this instrument, is used to measure the BRICS units, which is also the sap density. And this is an important indicator of plant health vitality. Now, the wine industry started using, and then also the sugarcane industry, they measure sucrose, which is the same thing. So they use this instrument at scale. But it hasn't been used that much with the other range of fruit and vegetables until Graham Sate, who is a sustainable development agricultural consultant and lecturer. He started enticing some retailers on the east coast of Australia in the Brisbane area to pay farmers based on not on the weight of the produce, but rather on the BRICS index. So the higher the BRICS index, the greater the vitality and the greater the price the farmer was paid, and in turn, the retailer was selling the fruit and veg for. And very soon the farmers realized if they're growing things industrially, it just doesn't have the same vitality as if you grow it organically. So just imagine if you go and pay for your fruit and vegetables based on BRICS units instead of by weight. You're then starting to eat good, healthy food that's good for you, and it's also good for the local environment. And just some interesting elements to remember. Conservation farming in agriculture has built its entire success story on one tree. And this tree is called the Fadiba albida. Its other name is the Anna tree. it exhibits a reverse phrenology, which means that it loses its leaves in summertime instead of wintertime. And this is in the southern hemisphere where they get summer rainfall. It's not a Mediterranean climate. Now, this is an amazing tree. They're planting it on usually about a 10-meter grid, and it's a huge water pump, and it's an amazing canopy tree nitrogen fixer. So it brings up nitrogen and brings up water, and all the maize and sorghum and potatoes and everything that's grown around it, the farmers there hardly suffer from any drought. And its leaf litter that falls down in summertime is the equivalent in a mature tree of 300 kilograms of fertilizer and 200 kilograms of lime. That's the equivalence. Then vetiver grass. There's a wonderful handout on vetiver grass in your notes. This is an amazing grass. Look at its long, hairy roots. It's used in wetlands, but it can also be used to stabilize soils and embankments. And it doesn't spread, so it grows through its root system. And then also Paul Stamets. Now, this guy is a legend, and there's a link that we will remind you about in the discussion forum. Please do have a look at it, because he's quite a wizard when it comes to adding value to soils, because without the mycelium in the soils, we're getting nowhere. So he's applied his mind, and look at what he does with mycofiltration. So here is a body of water that's pretty stagnant, infested with algae, and what he does to clean up the pollutants that are coming into it, here's a water channel with wastewater. He's putting almost like a rusk that he dumps in there, but this is a straw bale that's inoculated with mycelium, and he inserts it into this canal. And as the water moves through the straw bale, it interacts with the mycelium, and all the heavy metals and toxins are trapped. He's done the same thing with mycoremediation, where he was called to the Gulf Oil with the BP Deep Sea Horizon blowout. They created some Hessian bag pontoons that were filled with straw and inoculated with mycelium, and they were gobbling up the oil and stopping the oil from spreading. But do have a look at his slideshow. You'll see all these in detail. And then some urban permaculture solutions. Jacqueline, you want to speak to this slide?
Yes, I just wanted to add some of these, because people say to me, well, I live in a big city, I can't do anything, I have no land, I have no gardens, no nothing. And in actual fact, it really is possible to grow food almost anywhere. So I wanted to introduce a few of these photos just to inspire people who would really like to grow some stuff and to get their hands in the soil. So in the top left-hand corner, there is Incredible Edible. You can go online and Google this. It started in a place called Todmorden in England, but it's spread all over the world now. And what they do is they just put planters outside, wooden planters or something like that, and they fill them with soil, and they start planting food, and they say, this is food to share. Anybody who wants to can take it. And so that is a really beautiful initiative, and it's done a huge amount of good to turn around the local economy in Todmorden, where they now actually have incredible edible tourism, apparently. Of course, if you are in a city as well, there's a possibility for gardens on rooftops. There are quite a few of these in New York, for example, but this one here with the greenhouse is actually in Brussels. I helped with the creation of it a few years ago, and it's actually on the 6th floor of a multi-story parking garage right smack bang in the center of Brussels. Then, of course, you know, there are things like community gardens on the left-hand side. Detroit, of course, is becoming famous for its urban and community gardens, which are really regenerating the whole city. Here is just below it is a community garden in Berlin. There are many of them all over the world in big cities now. So if you really want to, you can start one or you can join one. If you have a garden, you can actually even create a food forest. Graham Bell's food forest is in a small town called Coldstream in Scotland, and it is really a mature food forest. It's about 25 years old now, but it really has a remarkable yield every year in fruit, nuts, soft fruit, perennial vegetables, salad leaves, and all of some annuals as well. And it's just a joy to take part in doing something like that. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's also trespassers will be composted. This is Jetto's patch in Perth, in the suburbs of Perth. So if you have a, if you're in the suburbs and you have a garden, you can actually start creating a food forest in your suburban garden, and you can share it with your neighbors and get your neighbors involved as well. You can create whole streets of people who are creating food forests in their garden, which is what Ecoburbia is doing. That's the picture at the bottom in the center. That is Shani Graham in her suburban house outside Perth with her goats, and that is really quite a remarkable project. I can recommend actually going online as well and having a look at that. On the right-hand side, there are 3 pictures of what you can do on balconies and windowsills in major towns. These are 3 pictures of my windowsills and balconies in various places, because very often in a city, I've been separated from my garden. So instead of wanting to go to the garden every day to get stuff to cook, it's really great to just have some easy things growing on a balcony or a garden or a windowsill. So squash and tomatoes will grow on a balcony, even on a windowsill if you get the right type of tomatoes. You can also do a real permaculture job there, so you can stack it so that the things that need sunlight most are at the top. The plants that need shade are lower down. You can also do a little bit of composting in there. You can use it for seedlings. You can even recycle water. What I usually do as well is I make sure that I also have bee plants, salad leaves, herbs, tomatoes, squash, pest control plants that will attract pest control insects, and somewhere where I can do a bit of composting. So the one in the middle is the balcony I had in 2014, I think it was, 13 maybe, in Brussels, which was extremely productive. And what you can do, then instead of going all the way to the garden, is you can just pluck a few things, all of those leaves, and just chuck them in a salad for lunch. The bottom one I'm particularly fond of because it's proof of how you can grow something on a windowsill on the 6th floor of a major metropolis. And to prove it, there's the Eiffel Tower in the background. What you can see there hanging up along the shutters is actually beetroot, which I grow for the leaves because they're very nutritious leaves in salad. So I've been munching on those, which is why they're looking a bit miserable. But in the foreground, you can see some of the other herbs and lettuce leaves that I've been growing. And the taller plants are actually white mustard, which I always plant because they are one of the first plants that flowers in the year. So they attract the first bees that need some food directly after they've woken up after the winter. So there's a huge amount that you can do if you really want to do it. So I just really would say, don't say, I live in a city, I can't do anything, because yes, you can.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And even if you're really stuck with space, you can at least support the local veggie box scheme or buy organic. You know, that supports generally the local farmers. And then we're just going to finish off with some sources of inspiration. These are some of the cutting edge folk out there. There's a youngster called Zach Loops who's written this amazing book called The Permaculture Market Garden. And he's a shining example of how to make a reasonable living on a small holding. Read his book. It's beautifully illustrated and extremely practical. There's no wishy-washy stuff about him. He's tried and tested his approaches. He's got these perma beds that he lays out and works in sets of threes. He's got 3 forms of social enterprise on his farm. He works with the 3 sets of beds, and he'll even put a little polytunnel over a set of 3 and put chickens in there or whatever he does. But his planning is immaculate, and you can learn so much from this guy. Then another guy that's very inspirational as well is Richard Perkins, who's really applied this keyline scale of permanence in Sweden. He bought a small holding and he's completely permaculturized it. Have a look at his book as well, but he's on YouTube and he's very inspirational as a speaker. He explains things very neatly. And then you've got the Grandmaster himself, Sepp Holster, on very, very steep land in Austria, what he quietly was getting on with for a couple of decades until he came out the blue and says, this is how I've been doing permaculture. And his claim to fame is, instead of swales, he really buries woody matter in his swales. He creates these huge, what are called Google cultures. You can imagine like a big sausage roll filled up with decaying woody matter that attracts all the fungi. Now, in the soil, you need both fungi and all your bacteria. The bacteria munch away, they do the heavier work, whilst the fungi do all the chemical breakdown, but they're both equally important. And then he also had his pigs that range throughout his farm, and he's created these nice little pig houses in the landscape, and they house themselves there in winter throughout the year. And then he's a miracle water worker. He's laid out all these waterways full of fish, and he was also called into the eco-village at Tamera in Portugal, where he helped them design their water-retaining landscape. So these 3 individuals, do have a look at their websites when you get a chance beyond the JEDs. We don't expect you to read all this during the JEDs itself, but we're leaving you with these sources of inspiration and probably several others that we'll post onto the learning platform. Don't stress about having to digest all of this. Go back to the basics, which is the manual, and look at this slideshow for the live session just to recapitulate some of the stuff. But it is one of the most taxing modules because there's so much information packed into it. So take it home and study beyond the JEDs. And the last slide we want to leave you with, if you want to make an impact in your own small garden, wherever you are, remember mulching, composting, get your mycelium running, exchange your seeds, plant diversity, get your worms going, that's vermiculture, do a bit of rainwater harvesting with some mini soils, create your microclimates, recycle your grey water, and more importantly, form your permaculture guild group where you inspire yourselves to achieve the next best thing. And then remember that your health is your wealth. If you eat good organic food, it improves your health, it improves your bioregion, it improves the whole planet. So thank you very much for listening. Apologies for the lengthy live session. But let's see if there's any questions that we can field, Jacqueline.
Yes, I've just I've just asked, are there any questions in the chat? I don't know if anybody does have a question they want to ask at the moment. Don't forget, of course, that we're both always available for emails and that type of thing. And we will also, because we're such fanatics about this, we will keep on posting things in the discussion forum that we think you might be interested in.
Cool. I think there's no pressing questions, so let's stop the recording now then.
Yep.
And then,
Okay.
Stop the recording.